Welcome to the Greater Culture Podcast, where movement, mindset, and mastery meet. Join us as we explore the art of living fully with expert guests and real-life stories to inspire your journey. Welcome to another episode of the Greater Culture Podcast with your host, Brad Marshall. Today, really excited to take a different spin on our approach. Typically have guests on, we hear their story and dive into different insights. Today, we're taking a very specific topic. We're going to have a roundtable discussion around it. So our topic for today is the idea of mental performance and mindset, specifically as it relates to CrossFit and training and competing. So excited to be joined by Ruth and McGoldrick, two folks who've been on the podcast before, both athletes, both also coaches. So it'll be a fun perspective to dive into for today of figuring out how do we help people not only understand what mental performance is, but also how do we go about building, enhancing, or training it to get ourselves ready for the season that might be upcoming, your local competitions, or just going into the gym day in and day out. So fellas, excited to be joined by you today. And I figured it'd be a great spot for us to just kick things off with understanding what is mental performance. So when you think about this concept or this idea, how do you go about either defining or characterizing what it's all about?
Well,
you're up, Kyle.
Am I going to go first, Mike? I tend to think of mental performance as the umbrella that sits above everything that you do, because everything that you do from a performance perspective is controlled by the mind. The mind leads the body, not the other way around, and there's no way to get around it. And I think that mental performance encompasses so many different things. Your attentional control, your ability to direct your focus somewhere and keep it there. And I think people underestimate how much of an impact that has on performance. I think your resilience, your ability to deal with animosity, to deal with change, to deal with the chaos of sport. I mean, outside of very regimented racing sports, swimming was one of them. Track and field is one of them, but even track and field, the environment changes a little bit. I'll use swimming as my example. That, there's very little chaos that's introduced there. You dive in, the water's always 78 degrees. There's always 2 lane lines between you and the person next to you. You're swimming down, you're turning, you're coming back. There's not a lot of resilience needed there. But as soon as you leave a very discrete sport that's just go down, come back, get out, and it's always the same environment, and you move into a CrossFit realm where the events constantly change, the field constantly changes, there's constantly environmental aspects that you have to deal with. Sometimes you're at altitude, sometimes it's cold. Resilience is a massive component of it. And then I think another one is just your ability to maintain composure under pressure, right? So you need the ability to maintain your focus under pressure, but also the ability to just maintain sort of an even keel under pressure. Some people have a tendency to get way too excited. Their arousal level goes off the eyes off chart. And then some people have a tendency to crumble under pressure. And so I think that is really important as well. So I think, I don't want to say that those are the 3 main parts of it, but those are the 3 things that really come to mind for me when I think about what mental performance is, and especially mental performance in a chaotic sport like CrossFit or a field sport or things like that.
Yeah, that was awesome, Kyle. I think I have less of an educator definition on it, and I think of it from more solely a strict coaching perspective of I have athletes that have goals and they have this absolute physical potential, and what can I do, or what are the things that are stopping them from achieving that in a performance setting or a training setting? And that kind of backs into the tools that we might use to help understand how the mind is holding them back from doing those things. And I think, to kind of echo what you were saying, I think pressure is a big one, how several athletes react differently to pressure. And that's a question I'm always trying to answer is why are some athletes so clutch in high pressure moments and others are not? And what's that skill that we need to train, and how do we actually do that? So yeah, that's something I'm constantly trying to solve and have conversations with athletes and to figure out, when they ask me, I need to get better at my mental game, there's so much more to unravel with that than just saying hey, I need to get my back squat up, especially in CrossFit, because there's so many different types of external influences and different types of pressure that impact how good someone is at the sport or in their training. And that's the fun part of it too, is that's why us as coaches at Training Think Tank kind of gravitate toward CrossFit as a sport, because there's a lot of different elements and it's exciting to have all these different components to play with.
Yeah, one of the things I think is most interesting about mental performance is there's, like you said, there's so much to unpack there, because the things that influence someone's ability to handle pressure or ability to maintain focus or their resilience, like those things are all tied back to the stories that they tell themselves and the stories that they're consuming from the culture, from training culture, and like the stories that they were told about what it means to be tough and things like that when they were growing up. There's just, it's such a complicated intertwined thing, and that's why I think as coaches, we find it easy to improve someone's 1RM back squat, like Mike said. But this part of the game, a lot of people just want to be hands off because it is complicated. But the reality is, like, once you get to a level where you're trying to help people perform, competitors, that's the way I think about it. This is the game. You know what I mean? It's like, it's easy to get someone's back squat up or to improve a 2K row, but this is the game. Doing it when it matters, when it counts, under pressure, in weird environments. That's what really matters.
Yeah, it's always an interesting element. You have someone that's a great trainee. They're fantastic at hitting numbers in training. When they have control over all of the variables, the second you put them in a spotlight or put a camera on them or have a judge on them, they underperform. And that's something that, we're always trying to solve. And I think as a good coach, you need to have tools to kind of understand that and figure out, like, you can't just tell them, hey, you got to deal with pressure better. And they're like, I'm trying. You have to figure out, like, how do I, just like I'm training someone's, strength metrics, like, what's my process, what's my system? And that comes with kind of developing an understanding of where their mind's at, and, coming up with your own creative tools and conversations, lots of talking, helping them reframe their own narrative, how they view themselves, how they perceive winning and losing, failure, etc. And I think that learning to look at high pressure scenarios as opportunities is a big one. Making sure that they don't perceive them as like, this is a chance for me to fail. It's more of like, hey, this is a chance for me to achieve something awesome that I really love and care about. And having that conversation over and over is really helpful, and like kind of reframes a perspective on athletes so they can start chasing down those opportunities, and they approach their training a little bit differently, and they go in more confidently, and they're excited about being put in a position where they might fail because they know something great could come from it.
Yeah, one of the things I love that you're both highlighting is, one, the importance of it, but also starting to tease out what it actually is and how do we pinpoint it to go make changes if we want. I had heard it described, which is the way I love sharing this with folks, of when you think about how we get better at anything pretty much in life, there's 3 things we can train or 3 things we can work on. One is the physical side. We can get stronger. We can build our capacity. We can build our VO2, all of those things, how we eat, sleep, etc. So we can train the body to physically be better. We can train the craft to be more efficient at the technique or what is being asked of us. And then the third pillar is really the mindset piece of, we can mentally train ourselves to be competent in any environment and in any situation. And as coaches, I think we get really tied to understanding, hey, the squat, how do I get better at that? The deadlift, the press, the muscle ups. And we don't always do the same thing with understanding that there are very specific skills underneath the umbrella, as you said, Kyle, of mental performance, where if we really want to help somebody get better at a specific skill, we have to understand what that skill is and what is being asked of it there. So when you think about some of those components, you've already started to highlight some of them, but what are some of the components or skills when it comes to mental performance that you've seen in athletes be the most meaningful or impactful for their ability to translate training into then competition? Because for most folks, that's when they want to do their best, when the lights are on, qualifiers here, event on the weekend, whatever it is. So what are some of the skills, if you could name some specific ones, that you've seen be really meaningful for folks?
Well, I'd say 2. Attentional control, the ability to narrow your focus to what needs to be done right now. I talk on my Instagram all the time. I talk about execution and how important game day execution is, and that in the end, it's like kind of the only thing that matters in competition. There's more to it than that. It's a little oversimplification, but being able to narrow down your focus and keep it on one task. What do I need to be doing right now? Because I think of attention as like a finite thing. I've got 100 attention units, and if I'm spending 5 of them thinking about what Mike is doing to me on the toes, doing on the toast bar next to me, and 10 of them I'm spending thinking about what I have next, and a handful of them I'm thinking about what the judge is telling me and how like maybe that was a BS no rep, 10 reps ago, then I have a limited number to focus on what I'm supposed to be doing right now, how I'm executing, etc. If you can get someone to focus as many of those attentional units on the thing that they are to be doing right now, then they tend to execute much better. So I think that's a big one, that sort of attentional control. The other one is arousal control. So I think that it's really important to make sure that you are at the right level of excitement for an event when you're going into it. If you watch Mike lift, he's the best example of this ever. If you watch Mike going into a 1RM, he gets so ramped up, like he's visibly shaking before he goes out there. I mean, it's like his entire demeanor changes, his
My
face,
palms are sweaty.
and knees weak, arms are heavy. There might be vomit on his sweater already. But no, Mike goes out there and like he turns into a bull, and there is no weight that's going to prevent him from moving it. That is arousal control in its finest. But if Mike did that same thing before, a 25-minute AMRAP of box jump overs, toes to bar, and burpees to the bar, then he would go really fast for a really short period of time and not get very far in the workout. So I think understanding how to leverage your excitement is really important. And I also think it's really important to keep in mind that like in a sport like CrossFit, where you have this like super diverse range of events, where you have events that are super fast and super powerful, you need to learn how to ramp yourself up. But you're also going to potentially have 40-minute endurance events where you need to be going into it like cool as a cucumber. But also understand that like everybody needs something a little bit different within that spectrum of arousal. So I think teaching people how to control their focus, and there we can talk later about some of the tools to do that, but I think teaching people how to control their focus and teaching people how to optimize their intensity for an event are like the two biggest ones. There's more, it's more complex than that, but I think those are the two big ones I think of.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that comes to mind is I heard a psychologist say this one time of attention is the currency of performance. If you want to perform well in anything, we have to be presently focused on whatever the task is. And the second piece there around intensity and arousal is just efficiency, like you said. CrossFit's kind of the sport of who can be the most efficient, the least leaks in energy, the most efficient in the way you move and the way you exert energy. If we're wasting energy, it's going to be really hard to perform the way we'd like. So I love that. So attention and then arousal control or just energy management there.
Yeah, I mean, I think to even go a step further back than that, good execution is a product of consistent training. And if you want to you need to earn the ability to rely on really solid execution through training practices. So that's kind of like the low-hanging fruit. That's like making sure all the simple boxes are checked and making sure that you can snatch 80% of your 1 rep max consistently, rep after rep after rep after rep, to be able to rely on your ability to just go out and go through the motions on the floor, to be fully engaged and focusing on the execution well before you can go out and assume that, all right, I know I'm a good executor or I'm like very focused, but I don't have the skills or the proficiency in the lift. You can't just like assume it's going to happen, because then your execution is off, even though you had the focus. So you could focus all you want, but if you don't have the skill for it, it's not going to happen. So that's like
see red and magically snatch 285.
Yeah, like I mean, I have some people that are really sharp mentally, but they just haven't put the time in to be a great executor, and that's not like a mental thing always. That's sometimes the truth and reality is like it's not a mental game. It's about hours and time and making sure that you have earned the ability to rely on that in the moment. And then I think you talked about like a tool that I use with athletes, narrowing focus, and that's choosing avoidance. When athletes will often choose avoidance goals versus approach goals. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to avoid this failure. Weightlifting, again, is such a good example to follow on, because it's like you got 3 attempts, there's a ton of pressure, and I always like it to kind of use it as a construct for execution under pressure, because it's pass or fail. Like you showed up, you executed the lift, or you did not. CrossFit workout sometimes you kind of have time to adjust as you go. Maybe you kind of blew it the first minute, but you could recover the next minute. Weightlifting's very like binary in that sense. So I think those are just good examples for me, because if you're going out and you're fully engaged and focused on the execution of the lift versus the avoidance of missing, that's a way that you can back up and look at what's my process going into this to make sure that I'm not kind of distracted from the things that could happen and more focused on the cues and the execution of the lift itself.
I think what Mike touched on there is really important as well, but it relates back to confidence, and that I think having confidence on game day is important, but I think confidence is built through practice. And so if you want to be confident stepping onto the competition floor, you can only do that. You could be fake confident and like carry bravado and whatnot, but to truly be confident in yourself and believe in yourself, you have to have done the work, and you know whether you've done what you need to do to be prepared to go compete. At least anybody who has some experience is going to know. You might be naive going into your first competition and think you're really fit, and all of a sudden you get exposed in the first event and you're like, whoa, not as good as I thought I was. But once you get through that initial stage, you know if you've done what you need to do. And I think that's how people build confidence. And confidence is one of the things that can help people rise. We were talking about rising or falling with pressure. Confidence is one of those things, and help you execute. So this is kind of, Brad, you and I had a conversation in the first podcast we did, but I talked about how the mental and physical are like two sides of the same coin. This is exactly what I was talking about. It's like you go do all this physical practice and all this physical training, and that is what actually gives you the confidence to go compete and execute on game day. And so you can't separate, like, mental performance is not separate from performance. We like to draw our lines in the sand and say, this is the mental side and this is the physical side.
Yeah. And I mean, something that a lot of athletes I see avoid is facing the realities of what that competition scenario will be like. They say they're training and getting ready to compete, but they're not kind of ripping off the Band-Aid in training and putting themselves in the high pressure scenarios to do their homework earlier, which is kind of like facing, some potential failures and screwing up and kind of like getting it out of the way before you show up in competition. And they get exposed a lot in competition. And you see that with athletes just by their body language, the conversations they have. The first two events, they have all these excuses on why it didn't go well. And like, there's nothing worse than hearing that as a coach. You're just like, stop. Like, just stop. You were underprepared. I tried to put you in this scenario in training. You avoided it. You didn't get a judge. You didn't do all these things that create a very similar scenario. And you see, I'm guilty of it myself sometimes. You see athletes often fail because of that, and just show up unprepared. And I think that's one of the big tools, is making sure that you sit down, think about what are the situations that freak you out, that create this kind of external pressure or would limit your ability to execute optimally, and create that scenario in training as often as possible.
There's some really interesting stuff from Stoic philosophy where they talk about imagining your failure. So like you're projecting forward to the competition, right? So say you're 2 weeks out from Fizz to the Coast, for example, and you're thinking through the events, and rather than what most people want to do is they just want to like exude positivity about everything and be like, oh, it's all going to be great. I'm going to go out there. I'm going to crush this. I'm going to, smash that. And I'm going to feel great. Instead, think about what are the potential negatives? How can things get derailed? And walk yourself through all of those scenarios so that you can actually, over the next 2 weeks, address and mitigate some of those potential issues now, and then you have a plan to address them. And that is part of, like, when I talked about resilience, that's part of how I get people to be more resilient on game day, is to think about what are all the things that could go wrong, and then what's your strategy to deal with each one of those potential things that can go wrong. Then when it happens, well, oh, hey, you already have a plan for this, don't you? You're going to do this. Oh yeah, okay. You got last in the lifting event. I hate to call Josh Miller out because he's one of the nicest people ever, but he was not ever strong enough to be out of the bottom 5 in a lifting event. And so every time we would go into a semifinal or sanctional or an event, the first thing we would talk about is, okay, you just got last in the snatch. How do we get ourselves on the podium? And that was the conversation every time. And so it got to the point where we would go to an event and he'd take like 7th to last in the lift. And he'd be like, dude, we're not taking out of last place. it's a valuable tool for managing the emotional stress that's tied to what would normally be perceived as a failure, but he's already walked through that scenario a bunch of times and knows exactly how he's going to deal with it.
Yeah, there's so many instances of that, of like how you're going about training some of these different skills, of putting people in positions when you notice that there's an area that they can improve on. Because one of the things you said, Kyle, when I think about, the top ones, one that really moves to the top for me is this idea of self-awareness. And along with that is this idea of confidence, because a lot of people, at least in my work and folks that I've heard, they'll be like, I just really want to be more confident in this situation. They're like, how do I get there? And we realize that confidence is actually a skill that you can build. And just exactly what you highlighted, it is the conversation that's unfolding in your head that is built on the beliefs that you hold to be true. And the only way you can actually impact the beliefs you have is by doing the work, having coaches around you who maybe can help layer in some of those beliefs. And then that conversation you start to have about the scenario, a specific lift, a specific event, whatever, that starts to change because the belief is different. And I think where people go wrong is they start trying to put some of their conversations about the event in the external, like how am I going to do, how am I going to stack up, things they have no control over. And that's why your confidence feels like it's constantly going up and down, because you're like, I was super confident, but I took 10th in this event. And it was like, well, you might have performed to your utmost potential. So if we're measuring your belief based on your current capacity, that might be different than how you stacked up against the field. So encouraging folks to build confidence in things they have control over, my approach, my strategy, my ability to bounce back. That's where, if we want to build really strong confidence, we want to focus some of our time and attention, because as soon as we start relying on the person next to us or my placing on a leaderboard, your confidence is going to ebb and flow throughout a weekend, and that's not a very fun place to be. And I think we've seen athletes go through that really high and low scenario.
Yeah, Kyle, you could probably resonate with this, having just gotten back from Wadapalooza, but one of the best feelings as a coach, and I'm sure an athlete can share the same sentiment, is when they go to an event that is often a chaotic environment and you prepared them for something harder in training than what they are experiencing on site, they have this enormous amount of confidence. Like, oh, cool, or, hey, we did a heavier version of this at home. Like, you get those comments, and like that's like simple preparation to me. And like, as a coach, that's our job, to make sure that we look at all the, it's not being negative, like you were saying, Kyle, it's looking at all the potential hazards. You're preparing a mission to launch to the moon. Like, you look at all the things that could possibly happen and you prepare for it, you back into it, and you try to make sure that they're resilient in that aspect. If you try to set them up for success too much in training, they show up unprepared for the competition. So I think things like Wadapalooza, you show up, and if you had your athletes playing with super loud music where they can't hear a judge's call and they're getting no reps, or you get them up really early and you change one of the movements because it's raining. You did that in training. Like, they're going to show up and just roll with it and be super cool with it, and they're going to execute so much better.
It really does come down to a lot of game day performance comes down to preparation. And in the end, there's not like I said, there's not a distinction between mental preparation and physical preparation. I do think there's a really fine line, like kind of what you were touching on there, where it's like you want to prepare them for events that are potentially harder than what they're going to see in competition. Now, there's a fine line there, because like you can't really go much harder than what they're going to do at the games. But if you do that too much, right, then you can break their confidence, because then instead of stacking these little successes in training, they've stacked a whole bunch of failures over and over and over. And so as a coach, I'm so unprepared. And even though they might actually be really well prepared, you just like you went way over the stimulus. And so it's really hard. It is really hard. I'm just going to acknowledge that as a coach, to ride that fine line with the, the top 1%ers of like, is this enough? Is this too much? Like, are we, erring on the side of over preparing or under preparing? It's such a challenging, especially in this sport, because I came from sprint swimming, and in sprint swimming, you could have people under prepared, but really confident. And man, they could go out there and they could go fast, because it really was just about speed. And you can't make someone that much faster, but if someone's confident, man, they're going to be faster. But in this sport, if you're under prepared for a 20-minute AMRAP, you're just straight up under prepared.
Yeah, you're not going to confidence your way through a 20-minute AMRAP sometimes.
No way. There's no amount of confidence that's going to drag you through. Like, that might help you for the first 5, but not the last 15.
So as a coach or as an athlete, I'm curious then, do you like to tease out and almost think of like, hey, we're putting on our training hat. This is a training mindset. Like, this is going to be hard. There's a good chance you're not going to succeed. You're going to fail, but that's the goal of our training mindset. We're learning, we're processing, we're developing. And then there's moments where you're like, I want you to put on your competitive hat. This is when 3, 2, 1, go is the lights are on. This is a different type of mindset and approach. Do you like to tease that out in your athletes versus having them feel like they're always in competitive mindset?
I think you have to. I think as a coach, it's important that your athletes understand that training is a playground where they are allowed to fail, right? They are allowed to go and test the limits of how many unbroken ring muscle ups they can do and then still be able to handle the thrusters right afterward. Or that one example, but like I think it's important for athletes to have the understanding that training is this, I don't want to call it low pressure because there's pressure in training, but like it's a low consequence environment.
Yeah.
And it's great to find your limits in your low consequence training environment. It sucks a lot more emotionally and sometimes for high level athletes financially to go fail on the stage because there's consequences for. Think about this from someone like Alexis's perspective, where, if she had finished 2 places lower in any one event, she was off the podium. And we're talking about $10,000 different. That would be tiny mistakes, $10,000 different. And you would much rather someone make those mistakes in the sandbox of training versus the actual like Wadapalooza sandbox environment that they had out there. So 100%.
Is there a way that you help encourage folks to do that? Because I think it's always fascinating as an outsider. Like, I coach our classes and things like that, and you can tell there's the athletes who it's like when it's 3, 2, 1, go, oh, I'm in a training mindset, but there's somebody next to me. Well, I'm immediately switching over. Or athletes who do well in a group environment where they've got training partners who are with them. And then some get burned out on that because they're like, man, every day I'm telling myself it's training. I'm telling myself it doesn't matter, but I'm seeing what the person next to me is doing and how they're pushing, and I'm doing the same. And I think it can be really challenging to put ourselves into that headspace of like, I might not worry about my score, and I might not worry if I beat the person next to me or Chad in the 5:30 p.m. class, because I really need to focus on just improving my efficiency, my technique, my strategy, whatever it is. Are there ways that you've come to help your athletes do that? I think of it, if they train by themselves, it's easy. If they train with groups of people or with training partners, it becomes a lot more challenging.
Mike, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, I mean, that's the difference between progression and testing in a sense of, the context behind the progressions where we're working towards something to be able to exceed this target that we're after based on a previous test or a failure that we might have experienced and something we need to improve based off of what is needed for them to be at a certain level they want to be at. And I think that's really clear, like from a good coach's perspective, when they discuss that with the athlete, like, hey, like these rowing progressions, I know you could finish out the last 2 1Ks that we're doing at 5 to 10 seconds faster than the target pace. That's not the intent right now. So like making those things very clear. However, giving them clear targets and guidance on like next week, it will go up. So it kind of guides them and handholds them a little bit to ensure that it's not just them constantly like testing their limits all the time, which does lead to burnout. And like Kyle knows that. And I think just pretty much wrote a post on like how it doesn't always have to be like a suffer fest to improve. But there are times, like Kyle was saying, where you have an opportunity to allow them to experiment and play and test limits without any major consequence. And I think that's super important because, like he was saying, you have to test limits in training to learn where you're at on certain things. And that comes with what unbroken set of gymnastics you can do, or what pace can you hold at the start of a 20-minute AMRAP, where it's like, look, I'm not giving you I'm not going to handhold you on a target pace for this. I want you to go and go out hot early and see what happens. And like, hey, like you might blow up, but you also learn like, all right, I just got to pull back a little bit on that. And like, the painful experience of that leaves such a long lasting impact on their ability to learn for themselves than I could ever write in any training note. So I think that's so important for them to kind of have that own experience for themselves, so that they walk away like they remember how that felt, and they go in next time and they are like extremely aware and very clear on what their limits are.
That's such a good point too. So especially since we're talking about the mental side of training, that a lesson learned through experience is so much more valuable than a coach, me telling an athlete something. Like when you go out there and you learn it with the pain of experience and emotion, it's burned in there. There's no get like it's in there and it's in there for life potentially, maybe traumatically. I might have said the exact same lesson 25 times prior. This actually happened in Dubai. I'm going to call Toby out. This happened when I was coaching in Dubai. It's the first time I'd ever coached Toby in person, and we were going into he'd had what was going to be his worst event. Right, we just finished what was going to be his worst event of the weekend, and we were going into one that he felt like he could. It was the chest to bar, like sandbag squat, like interval style, right? And he's fast, super strong, can handle that 200-pound sandbag squats like it was a joke. And he's really good with chest to bar, despite the fact that he's a bigger athlete. And I remember being in the back and he's like, I'm going to rip these chest to bar. Like I have the fastest cycle speed of anybody out here. I'm like, dude, hey, just remember that like you can't win by trying to win. Like you can't win unless you're focused on executing. And part of execution is like staying in your lane here and winning where you can win, which is the sandbag squats. Well, he goes out there, gets out of rhythm on the first set of chest to bar, has to break a set of 20 chest to bar. We're talking about a guy with like a 50 or 60 unbroken set of chest to bar, has to break at like 18, drop off, jump up, do two more because he was out of rhythm. So he's way behind, goes out, does his sandbag squats, flustered, cut in the first interval. He came out and he's like, before I went out there, I didn't understand what you were saying. He's like, yeah, he was like, I hear you say you can't win by focusing on winning. You only win by executing. And he's like, yeah. And he's like, now I understand.
Yeah, sometimes you got to touch the stove to actually know that it's hot.
Yep. He touched the stove and he learned the lesson.
And
Well,
as a coach, you're like, oh, I hate watching it, but lesson learned.
I mean, it's the same thing with kids too. Like you can tell your kids a million times not to touch the stove, but once they touch the stove, they know better.
Yeah, I think that's why it is so important to give people that freedom, like you said, of like, hey, I want you to go out and max set before you go into the rest of this workout. I know you'd never do that, but let's try it and see what happens. Let's really see if we can get the wheels to fall off so you can understand how you operate when mentally and physically you're exhausted, but you still got to figure out a way to navigate this workout. So that kind of gets us into this idea of how do we train the side of the house, because Mike, you alluded to a lot of conversations at times. Kyle, you alluded to conversations, but also we got to layer in some training because it's such a physically demanding sport that you can't separate the two. So in your experiences, what are some of the ways that you've gone about trying to work with your athletes? Is it a very systematic approach of, hey, we are going to work on your arousal control, your attention control, and here's how I'm going to do it? Or is it we're going to train and we're going to have some conversation and kind of layer things in along the way? Because I think there's a lot of ways to go about it. Some folks will seek out one-on-one work, and I know I've worked with a lot of folks that way. And then there's, the opportunity to work with folks day in and day out in the gym. So what are some of the ways that you've gone about trying to train or help people improve their mental performance?
Well, I think a big one, talking about arousal control. One of the things I have all my athletes do after training is we do some box breathing after every session. And my goal with that is to teach them the skill of ramping down their nervous system, the skill of calming themselves down when they're in, I mean, let's be realistic. Like the end of a Metcon's about as much of a fight or flight situation as your body can be in. I mean, every imaginable stress input has been triggered at that point, and like your goal is just to calm it down. So I start there. I start by just teaching them, hey, this is what it feels like to learn to relax after training. And I also have my athletes on their rest days, at least one day a week, do a longer guided, it might be a guided meditation, it might be a guided relaxation, you call it whatever you want to call it. But the reality is I often have used yoga nidra over the last few years, which that's that like non-sleep deep rest stuff that Huberman was on for a while. But anyway, it's very effective for bringing arousal down and just teaching people what it feels like to take a moment to calm themselves down is a really valuable tool for getting people, especially people who have competitive anxiety, to just remind them before then they have the skill, and before they're going out to compete, like, hey, before you go out there, take a deep breath, drop the tension from your shoulders, just like in that relaxation session you do every single Thursday. And they go out there and they go, and boom, some of that tension's gone and they're ready to go compete. And they, the thoughts get a little more clear for a fraction of a second. And so, yes, there's tools, there's structure to trying to give them some of those tools. Same thing with attention and focus. One of the things that I have played with, and I probably haven't been as consistent with this as I should be, but I've played with having athletes during their warm up do essentially like either attentional, like let them get distracted on the bike. So they're riding the Echo bike and like let your attention drift around the room. It's easy at TTT because there's stuff going on everywhere all the time. Or, if they're a gym owner, it's very easy to look over and be like, that coach should be addressing that thing over there. Let your attention go. But at the top of every minute, figure out where your attention's at and bring it right back to your RPMs on the bike. Now, don't try and keep it there, but just attention, bring it back to the bike. And you'll do that for 10 minutes. It's almost like a form of Buddhist meditation where you're counting your breaths, and anytime you lose track, you start back at zero. But it's literally teaching them to bring their attention back to center. And I think if you can get people to do that consistently, and just that's part of their warm up 3 days a week, then they're starting to recognize like, hey, I can bring my attention back. And then I give them a cue, like, hey, my cue, I get distracted in the middle of workouts and things too, but my cue is stay here. When I notice my attention start to drift away from what I should be focusing on, I just tell myself to stay here, and that can lock me back in a workout. And it's not perfect, but at least those are the major tools that I've used. Some of the things I haven't done well, I don't think I've taught a lot of my athletes how to like actually get ramped up. Mike knows how to do it. I know how to do it. We learned it through practice, but I've never spent time trying to teach it.
Yeah. I mean, from my experience, I've definitely had a larger majority of athletes not need necessarily the ability to kind of calm themselves down or, I'd say arousal control. It's more of like controlling an overwhelmingly high amount of fear, doubt, insecurity, anxiety going into competitions or a workout or whatever. So, why that happens, you have to understand with the athlete what it is. Maybe they've failed at something similar in the past and they're overgeneralizing. So, because it happened one time, they kind of assume it's going to continue to happen. Like, I failed a snatch in a high pressure moment on event one and it kind of bombed me for the weekend. It's like they will overgeneralize that this continues to happen, and you have to help them confidently in training to work through that. So making sure that they understand that because something just happened once, it will not happen again. It's not a guarantee. And then I think, like you were saying, bringing attention back to focusing on execution goals versus avoidance goals, and then helping them reframe their thoughts. So if they're going in, like let's assume that they're confident, they checked all the boxes in training, and they show up, they still have that doubt. Like, and sometimes that happens, like you get triggered by seeing a competitor that's doing something better than you, and like you all of a sudden you're like insecure, like I didn't do that. Like how do I kind of bring myself back? And I think you have to talk with them and say, look, like, remember the times that you have executed well in these moments. Like, you've done this before. You've shown up and been super brave and executed under pressure. Like, lean on that. Like, you can do that again. Like, that's who you are. And I think you have to show them that, to tell them that, to give examples. Really powerful tool, because the mind wanders quickly, and it's a mechanism to protect ourselves, and we want to make sure that we can kind of control that, so that we constantly reframe those high pressure scenarios into this positive environment of like, this is a chance for success. Like, I have to remember that. And that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It's going to be hard to overcome, but like when I do, it's going to be awesome. And you have to just beat that into their heads over and over. And once it hits one time, they'll start gaining momentum with that, and they just become a more clutch performer.
Yeah. And I think that alludes to a really good point about mental performance. It's just like any other skill or movement we're trying to learn, is that it doesn't just overnight all of a sudden be perfect. It's not like, oh, I read this book on confidence and I'm 100% confident all the time. It's constantly takes energy, time, and energy of effort of trying to understand how your mind works in this scenario and that scenario and whatnot. And so there's certain things that you can lean on and fall back on. And then, like you alluded to, Mike, of this idea of having a support system can be critical too. I'd love to be able to do this on my own, but there's times I might have to lean on somebody, and my coach can help me do that. And having an understanding of what are the pitfalls that people experience. Is it the conversation that's unfolding in my head that makes me maybe experience doubt, insecurity, anxiety? Is it I can't focus on my lane? Is it I can't get ramped up or calm down? Starting to be a little bit more aware of where are those areas, especially in training, where you're starting to get frustrated or fall short. And that's then where you can say, okay, I need to spend some more time on this specific mental skill, because then it'll translate to game day versus just trying to work on everything all at once. It gets to be overwhelming and it's too much.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
Sorry. Yeah. I've had experiences in the past where I've had that. I say a good example that everyone could probably relate with is pacing in a CrossFit workout. 10-minute workout, 3, 2, 1, go. Everyone goes out flying, and you immediately have this insecurity of like, I'm not going fast enough. And every molecule in your body is like, go faster, are trying so hard to slow down. And you're actually going at a normal pace, but it feels extremely slow based on the perception of how your competitors are moving. And then sometimes you are behind, but oftentimes it pays off and you have the last 2 minutes and you have the kick. And that's a very positive experience, kind of like the inverse of learning from a negative experience. When you have that first experience of trusting yourself and your instincts and sticking to your pacing plan, Alexis had a fantastic example of her final event this weekend. Didn't blow it out too fast, didn't chase the field, paced her ring muscle ups, did small sets, and you could tell it was like such a perfectly executed plan. Ended up getting second or third in the event, I think, which landed her on the podium, which was just like such an awesome example of someone like sticking to their guns, having an enormous amount of confidence in their own plan. And once you experience that and you see it work, you're like, all right, like that's a level of confidence that's kind of hard to shake in those workouts moving forward.
What I was going to say is I think, Brad, touching on your point that, people, this is such a complicated, multifaceted topic that people don't know where to start. Like they don't even know where to begin trying to address these things. And you brought up such a good point that like you can spend some time identifying the mental performance limiters that you might have. And it might be arousal control. It might be pacing strategies. It might be confidence. It might be any of those different things. And then there are tools that you can use to address those things. There's a quote that I love that it's a training related quote, but it applies here. And that's just that which you can measure, you can improve. And if you can come up with ways to quantify some of these things, right? Or at least categorize them. All right, this is an arousal issue. This is a pacing issue. This is a confidence issue. Then you can start to figure out which tools you need to use to address each of those different potential problems. And I think it would maybe demystify this whole concept of
it's very abstract. And again, kind of hard to dissect and figure out what are the components to actually train. God bless all the authors that write all the self-help books, because I read them and I call them feel-good books, because you read them and you get through it and you're like, it made me feel amazing. And then a month later, you're like, I haven't changed.
The only exception to that one that I've read was James Clear's book, Atomic Habits.
Yeah.
It's a good
That
one.
one was the ultimate self-help book. And when I read it, I was like, oh, this is like real valuable information.
Yeah, for sure. That was really solid. I did a talk last year called Practicing Pressure at a Camp. And I did my best to take this kind of abstract concept of like, how do we teach someone to be a more clutch performer? And I told it in stories, so I can send the link later, but I share it with all my athletes, and I think it's a very helpful tool. And I even have like a workbook with it that's like, these are the tools and things you can practice, like kind of outside of the gym, that help you gain a little bit more control over where your mind goes when approaching a competition scenario. And I found to be really helpful.
Yeah, that would be phenomenal. I know when I get a chance to work one-on-one with athletes, very similarly, if they're going to work with a coach, is we have more or less an assessment of, here's some scenarios, here's situations, rate yourself, scale of 1 to 5, 1 being I'm really poor in this, 5 being I'm great in this. And you start to get specific on the way I talk to myself, the way I manage stress, the way I handle my arousal, the way I handle, different scenarios. So it's fun then to start to say like, I'm actually tuning in. And I think for some folks, that is the starting point, is looking more inward versus external. So many times we go to the gym and we just work out really hard because we're trying to avoid whatever it is that's going on in our head and our bodies. And we're just like, I'll figure it out after. And then you realize that's not the greatest strategy, especially if you want to get better at performing. It's better to understand, hey, my mind's doing this because of X, Y, and Z. My body's doing this because of X, Y, and Z. And then you get control over it. There's a quote that I love, is that in order to perform our best, we not only have to understand our DNA, we also have to be able to override our DNA when it calls for it. So at the end of a Metcon and everything in you is saying drop and stop, there's moments it's like I have to override that because that's what's being called or asked of me, and I can figure out a way to navigate that and then deal with things after. So I think for a lot of folks, it's just that initial piece of let me start tuning in, let me be more aware. Coaches can see a lot of things that can help. Reaching out, if there's ever experts you want to work with, just to start to understand and piece together how mental performance plays a factor in it. At least in my opinion, I'd be curious from you all, the higher the level of performers, the more the mental performance game stands out, because at certain points, athletes are only so strong, their capacity is only so good, where it's like that's not the threshold that they're getting the benefits from, because like the person next to you is probably very similar strength and endurance, etc. So it's the strategy, it's the ability to stay present, it's the ability to remain calm throughout the course of a weekend that it really stands out as the physical skills, kind of get closer to each other.
And I think that's what would be exciting in the sport, is if the testing body became so much better and consistent that everyone at the highest level has all the same, similar, close to the same metrics. And then it's better racing then, because it comes down to how they handle it between the ears, their strategy and prep leading in. Like you look at pro sports and they've kind of figured out strength conditioning. Like they're all using very similar methods to train the athletes outside of it. It comes down to how do we play the game the best to figure out how to beat the other team. And right now, the sport of fitness and CrossFit is like the testing body changes that, where you have very polarized athletes' strengths and going through the events. And sometimes it's just not good races because someone is so much weaker than someone else in this, or, you just have like the bottom part of the field is like nowhere near the same level of rounded fitness as the top and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I watching the top level, the final heats when they're all very similar capacities race is so much more fun to me.
There was something that Brad said there that reminded me of a conversation we had at one point, Mike, about working out versus working in, and how important it is to spend time on
Paul
both.
Check.
Was that Paul Check?
Yeah.
Good old Paul Check, stacking rocks. Yeah. Anyway, it just made me think that like everybody in the sport, everyone in the space works out, but very few people spend any time working on what's in between the ears. And I think that in general, the sport would be better if people spent a little more time working between the ears. And I do know.
No worries at all.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for jumping in, Mike.
Bye, Mike.
Kyle, sorry to cut your thought off, man.
No, you're good.
All right, see you.
And Mike's gone.
Just like that.
Yeah. No, where I was going is I know athletes have worked with, I know a handful of athletes that have worked with sports psychologists in the sport, sports psychologists outside of the sport, to help their CrossFit performance. And I don't know, with mixed results, I think across the board. It's just it's a very different sport than a lot of others. And so it can be a little bit challenging for a sports psychologist to like take the skill set that they have for another sport and apply it to such a chaotic mash like CrossFit.
Yeah, I think, and I would agree with that. There are certainly some basic tenets and principles around sports psychology, studying it, going through it, working with a variety of athletes that they're like, but the way that they are applied is different sport by sport. And I mean, even when you look at something as what some would call closed sports, kind of like what you're talking about, swimming, a very like, I know exactly what I'm doing from this point to this point. It's the same every single time, versus open sports, basketball, football. It's like, I don't know what's going to happen. It's very chaotic, things like that. The skills can be applied differently. And similarly to finding the right coach who helps out, or the right nutritionist or anything like that, same thing can be said for mental performance, where there's a variety of practitioners out there. Finding the right one for you who helps you hit your goals is really the name of the game, if that's the route that's best suited for you.
Yeah, for sure.
So, well, with that, I want to say thanks so much for jumping in. This was a super fun conversation, one of my favorite topics, so fun to riff on this and hear some of your thoughts and experiences from the coaching perspective, from the athlete perspective, what we can learn, what we could take forward. And for anyone out there who's interested in diving in deeper, obviously reach out to Kyle or Mike over at Training Think Tank. Feel free to reach out for Brad over here at Greater Culture. I'm definitely always helping folks figure out what their potential is and how they can get closer to accessing it and enjoying the opportunity to perform, whether it's just a local competition, the Open coming up, or Fittest of the Coast, or even beyond. Working on that mental game, you might be surprised at how much of an impact it can make in not only your experience, but also in the end result as well. So for that, Kyle, thanks so much for jumping in today.
Of course, I appreciate it. Great conversation.